Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start with some of the advanced watercolor techniques. On the drawing handout, and it's on a different number in the painting handout, it says to use mask out with liquid frisket. Liquid frisket comes in different. It's made by different companies. Basically, it's a rubber. It's a liquid rubber. And so what you would basically do is use a brush. And I have brushes that are old and nasty that I use for this. I actually have them labeled as an F so that I don't use my good brushes, or don't you use your good brushes for it. And what you can do is use a brush to paint in anywhere that you want to preserve a color or the lightness. So if I have a little bit of white that I need to show, I will often kind of dot it in the way that I see it, or I'll kind of paint it in. This paintbrush doesn't have a lot of bristles left, but some of the other ones do. And so I can fill in a section. This frisket is pretty expensive, so you only want to use it when you need to, and you only want to use it for small areas. An example of it that was used in a student project is this one right here, where a student was doing this starfish, and all of those little white dots that you see, or little light pink dots, you'd have to leave that unpainted. And so what the student did is they did a wash of the light pink first. They let it dry, they put the frisket on top, and then let that dry. And then once that was dried, they went in and put the brighter red in and all the shadows that you see, and then they removed the rubber substance to reveal the lightness. And so we have to do that in steps. So right now, I'm going to actually leave this right now, let that frisket dry, and then we'll come back to it a little bit later. So the next section that you can do for masking out is masking film. Masking film comes on a roll, and I cut it to whatever size I need. I normally make it a little bit bigger than the shape that I'm going to make, especially if you do something really messy. You'd want to leave it like maybe an inch all the way around it so that you don't make a mess on something else that's important. It is pretty expensive. It's normally made for airbrushing. What I typically do to get to the part that I'm going to use is I bend a corner, and then when I lift the corner up, I can normally get my finger in between the plastic and the paper. And the paper you'll throw in the trash, and the plastic is basically a sticker. So I'm going to lay this on top of my shape. Okay, and then rub it flat. I'm going to make sure I remove all of the air bubbles that I see. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and use an X-Acto knife to cut out the shape. So you want to be extra careful when you're using the X-Acto knife. You don't want to cut yourself. Use common sense. Try not to cut towards your hand, so make sure your hand is out of the way when you're doing this. And what you want to do is carefully cut the film. You don't want to press too hard because it might snag the film, but also then you're going to be cutting into the surface of the board. So you want to be pretty precise about this, because if you're not, all those jagged marks or that imperfection is going to show when you actually remove the film. So you want to take your time to cut it out. Okay, and then what you're going to do is you're going to lift up the section that you want to paint. And so I'm going to go ahead and do this, and maybe I would do it a little bit carelessly, but you want to take your time. Just want to save some time here on the video. And what I'm going to do is peel up that inner part. Now I could use this if I was going to be going around the subject too. You could either keep this to do the background, or you would keep the outer edges to work on the object. And so what I'm going to do is use the sponge technique. So when you are using a really messy substance, and on the handout it says on project. I don't want you to cut for all of the ones that are messy film. It's really expensive. Save that for your project, your artwork. So you're going to do it just once with the sponging. So what you're going to do is add water to a color like you've been doing, right? And I typically like to layer colors, so I might do this on something that's already painted in with basic value. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a natural sponge. You can use artificial sponge as well. I'm going to press it into the watery color. So I'm going to tap it in there. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to sponge. So kind of sponge it into that shape, right? And kind of change the direction so it's kind of irregular. It looks a little patterned here by the piece that I took. right? And then I can also dunk it into another color if I wanted to and do it. Now, depending on how wet the substance is, it might bleed a little bit. So you might want to let it dry between the layers. Then your sponge is going to be nasty and dirty. And so if you're not going to use it anymore today, the best thing to do is to wash it, let it dry, use it again tomorrow. So I have many of these that you can borrow. And so if the one you're using is wet, don't worry about it. You would let this completely dry before you remove the film. But I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. I'm not going to worry about editing the video, so I'm just going to pull it up to show you how it will protect the outer edges of your object. So all that mess is on the film and not on your project. Okay, so that is masking film, normally used for airbrushing and stenciling. The next thing that we're going to do is plastic wrap. It creates a texture of kind of like shards. And so what you can do with this, as well as the wax paper, so I'm just going to show you once, and actually, I guess I do have some wax paper here too, so I'll do both. What you would do is use the household plastic wrap that you have, rip off a piece, then you would follow the directions, and what I typically like to do for some of these textures is I kind of go pretty concentrated. Concentrated basically means that take some water in your palette, rub, 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 rub. The more you rub, the stronger the color is going to be. Then what I would do is I would cut the film. You know, if I were doing it on my project, I'd cut the film, and then you would paint in your color. Okay, and then what you're going to do is you're going to lay the plastic wrap on top of the shape. And basically you can see here how the paint is pulling up. So in the areas where it's lighter, it's actually going to dry lighter. In the areas where you see the color darker, it's going to dry darker. The key with this, as well as the wax paper, don't take it off until it's dry, right? Give it some time. So often what I do here is with the wax paper, is I put something on top of it because it likes to move. So I'll often use like my Frisket bottle or something. The wax paper I can use flat or I can wrinkle it, lay it on top of the object, and then I'll sit something on top of it, like the Frisket, so that it dries. But basically, the way you see it through here too, that's going to be texturized. So you can see you got a little bit of leeway here about where it collects to and where it touches. Okay, so we're going to let those go until they dry. Okay, the next section that we have is the alcohol. And so what we're going to do for the alcohol is we're going to get ourselves some concentrated color. So that means rub, 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 right? We're going to paint in a color. I want the color to be a little bit stronger than that, so I'm going to get some more color. There we go. I'm going to go ahead and paint in my shape and use the alcohol. Now, the alcohol and the water kind of resists one another. And this is really good if you want to make Petoskey stones. That's from a region in Michigan where they have little circles on a rock. So what you would do is take rubbing alcohol. This is the stuff that's in your medicine cabinet at home. Dunk a brush in it. I really like the round brush with the red bristles. What I do is I drop, right, it onto the color. And you can see that it makes kind of like tie-dye rings, right? And so it kind of works concentrically. Normally it looks a little bit more like circles, but you can see how it makes a very irregular, and the color repels, the watercolor repels the alcohol. One thing you have to remember is the brush that I just used needs to go be washed at the sink. If I wash it in my water, it's almost like an oil slick. It will continue to do this effect wherever I paint. And if I get that in my palette, I've ruined the colors in my palette, and so you probably have to clean it. So be really careful that you clean that brush separately from your normal water container. So that's a specialized thing. You probably won't use that too much. The next one is another specialized one. It is using just regular old instant coffee. And there's different kinds of instant coffee. There is like your Folgers crystals. Starbucks makes Via, and that will work as well. So I have different kinds of that. The most common reason for using instant coffee is to make something look browned or rusty. So I'm going to make a yellow stone here, kind of like a banana color. And so if I were going to be painting a brown banana, I could actually use coffee. And so I've got coffee in here. I'm going to take a few grains of the coffee and sprinkle them into the wet paint. And so because the paint is watery and it's a wash, that instant coffee is going to disintegrate. It's going to bleed. And then what's going to happen is you're going to have brown spots on it. If it doesn't completely dissolve, you can always take a little bit of water and drop it on there, and eventually it will bleed. Just know that you're probably going to have a water blossom. So you have to decide, will a water blossom look okay in this, or would it look worse? And so you can choose to dissolve it. If you do too much coffee, it'll be very shiny, so you have to keep that in mind too. It's better to just take a little bit in your fingers and pinch it on rather than pouring a whole bunch of it onto the surface. Okay. Another technique that we're going to try is using some salt. Now I have different kinds of salt. I have table salt. I also have kosher salt. It's the kind you put on pretzels, so it's bigger. I personally like the table salt the best. I like it kind of the color kind of small. The key with using the salt is to use concentrated color again. So you really want to work the color, add some water to it, rub, and then paint in your section. The salt looks kind of like winter. You get all that striations that you see from all the salt on the roads, and that kind of crystallization. So if you need to make something look crystallized, what you would do is take a pinch of salt, sprinkle it wherever you want, and then it will start to dissolve. And once it dissolves completely, it's going to have a bunch of striations on it. So it's going to look like it is disintegrated. Okay, so I have an example from another class, and this is what it actually looks like. So it could be good for coral, or it could be good for you know, frosted sort of thing, or something that's just very textured. I could go back in here and add depth and add shadow with just dry brush to make it look more realistic of something like coral. Okay, so I'm going to let that dry. The last one that I have is the splatter technique. And of course with splatter, just like with the saran wrap and with the sponging, you'd want to use your Frisket film. This is what was left of my Frisket film, the positive of what I took out, so I actually saved it. And so I pressed it down here, and what I'm going to go ahead and do is take a toothbrush. You can use a brush, that will work too, especially like a stiff brush like the red ones, but you can use a toothbrush. And what you're going to do is you're going to dunk the paint into, or the brush, into paint, right? Kind of rub it around, and then you're going to flick it. So you're going to go like this, and you can see it's pretty messy, right? You're going to flick it onto this, and you could do layers upon layers upon layers of this if you really, really wanted to. So you could try different colors. I'm going to clean out the brush. I'm going to try something different, like maybe I'm going to do the yellow. I'm going to splatter some yellow onto this. This is the thing that people do a lot for sand or dirt, right? So put in like a base color, base value, and then they will Frisket what needs to be covered, and then they will add the splatter. So when this is completely dry, what you would do is peel up the film, okay, to remove it. And this just came off in a little piece, but you could remove the whole thing. I'm going to let this dry so I don't smudge and smear it all over the place. Okay, over here, I let my liquid Frisket dry. So we're going to go back to the first one. I let the Frisket dry earlier today. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to actually add some paint to this. So I would go in here and add my color and my value. So I would go in here and paint it in. And can you see how the paint is not attaching to where that rubber is? Okay, so I would add any details that I needed. If I had to add some shadow, maybe I would charge the side there, and I would let this dry. Okay, so the key is let it dry. Once it has dried, okay, the paint has dried, you can go ahead and go in here and remove your Frisket, liquid Frisket. So the paint is dry, the Frisket is dry, and what I do is I just rub And look what happens. It reveals a perfectly white dot where I put it on the white board. If I would have done this on top of yellow, I would have a yellow dot right there. So it's important to make sure that things dry before you rub them, or you'll smudge your color. Let's go ahead and see if our saran wrap has dried enough to remove it. I'm going to lift up and see what has happened. Looks pretty good. Still looks a little soft in areas, but you can see sort of the striation that's being made. Let's look at the wax paper. And that looks, like smaller striations. So just know that almost all of these techniques have a little element of surprise to them. And so what we do as artists is we make bad things work. We want to make them seem like it was intentional. So sometimes when things turn out like this, then we can go and add detail and color on top of it to make it seem more rock-like if we wanted. Like I would, clean up the edges, that sort of thing. Okay, so that is the basic advanced techniques. In painting, there's a few other ones that I have, but most of those are pretty self-explanatory, so I'm going to let you figure out how to do them yourself.